So this excerpt from February 13th, 2020, which is on my blog, jasondanielbailey.wordpress.com, is called The Spectrum of Consciousness on Earth. Consciousness precedes life. Consciousness on Earth originates with what I have labeled the variable electron reactive behavior, VERB, V-E-R-B. The variable electron reactive behavior in atoms prevalent at deep ocean volcanoes and hydrothermal vents on the early Earth, and it, consciousness, increases in complexity and depth of experience as the complexity of the structures and entities exhibiting consciousness also increase over time via natural selection and, more recently, cultural drivers. Consciousness is expressed on a spectrum. There is a correlation between complexity and an entity and the degree of consciousness it exhibits. In general, as molecules and eventually the life forms they are the basis of grow in complexity, so does the degree of consciousness. The spectrum of consciousness as it exists on Earth in both pre-life and living entities includes, but may not be limited to, the following 10 degrees. And just jumping in here, this list, these names of degrees and the definitions I'm about to read to you were actually listed and for the most part composed in about 30 minutes of a flurry of either insanity or inspiration. So the 10 degrees of consciousness include, but may not be limited to, reactivity, bonding, instinct, essential awareness, cognition, permanence, intention, foresight, self-awareness, and global awareness. Between bonding and instinct comes the actual beginning of life, though reactivity and bonding are both still degrees and forms of consciousness. Each degree above reactivity on the spectrum of consciousness also exists as a spectrum, each more broad than the next. Each degree of consciousness is dependent on the one which precedes it. I got to skip around a little bit because there's some things that I would since have eliminated, so I've got to scroll here. I will briefly define each degree of the spectrum of consciousness. Granted, the following terms and definitions may borrow terms already in use in other fields of psychology and theories of mind. The definitions are wholly my own. Again, what I'm about to read was, for the most part, written down in about 30 minutes. A friendly reminder, at every point along the following spectrum, natural selection is at play. A book I read recently, this very well respected physicist was discussing issues along the lines of what I write about here. And in a 300-page book, he's on page 200 before he even acknowledges the existence of natural selection. And so my marginal notes in that book are like, dude, where's Darwin? You gotta give him some place here. So anyway, here we go. The levels. Reactivity. Reactivity is the simplest degree or level of consciousness. It is the variable electron reactive behavior, VERB, occurring at the quantum level. When an electron reacts to a change in its environment, it does so in multiple ways: by adjusting the speed of its orbit around its nucleus, or its trajectory, the rate or direction of its spin, or it may even pop in and out of existence altogether in probabilistic manners. Reactivity is the level of consciousness upon which all others are built. There is no degree of consciousness on Earth simpler than reactivity. Regarding natural selection, all electrons react, causing their respective atoms to behave in various ways. Some do nothing of significance. Others find their way to the next level. Bonding. Bonding is the next level and is dependent upon reactivity. Bonding is the degree of consciousness where individual atoms bond with others to form molecules, where molecules bond with others to form membranes and bases. These form networks, and so on up the chain of complexity. Again, bonding occurs in all kinds of ways. Only those molecules selected by nature make it to the next level of complexity and bring us closer to the world we know today. Here we find the periodic bonding of salt and quartz crystals, precursors of the aperiodic DNA crystals that appear in the upper end of this level and lead curiously and seamlessly into the next level. Instinct. The next degree of consciousness, instinct, is the level where we first observe actual life. Instinct is not exclusive to life. The movement and sprawl of certain crystal colonies that are non-living, yet exhibit characteristics of life, are an example of instinct in non-living entities. The tendency to seek out optimal environments in which to thrive, even though they, the crystal colonies, are non-living, is possibly a wonderful example of consciousness at this level. Even more wonderful, replication of DNA strands, not simply bonding, but knowing how and into which structure to bond, is a low-level, though still quite impressive example of instinct. Instinct, of course, is observable in all living entities. For arguments of quantum processes involved in multiple cellular life, including birds and fish and humans, expressions of what we hitherto have labeled instinct, see Life on the Edge by McFadden and Al-Khalili. It's one of the many, many books that I gleaned information from, or actually most of them I read after I'd written the paper. So Life on the Edge by McFadden and Khalili, definitely worth checking out. Next level, essential awareness. This degree of consciousness is the earliest one occurring on the spectrum where true awareness becomes detectable. We see this in the awareness of a plant, knowing where the sun is located, heliotropism. We see this in a sperm cell's awareness of where to find the ovum. We would certainly not call a phagocyte a thinking being, yet it is obviously aware that a bacterium is in the vicinity and is able to act accordingly by gobbling it up. These are all examples of essential awareness. Cognition. Cognition is the earliest degree of consciousness on the spectrum where a thinking center is required, a brain. Though this degree also occurs on a spectrum, as do all degrees of consciousness, this is the earliest level where we can confidently say that thought is taking place. The emergence of a thinking center, brains, on Earth, and I keep emphasizing on Earth because I speak only for Earth. I don't speak for other planets and solar systems and whatever. So anyway, the emergence of thinking centers or brains on Earth, of course, are another result of natural selection. The ability to think is clearly advantageous to survival over not thinking. The spectrum of types of thinking centers, brains, from very primitive yet functional to the majesty of the human brain, is a result of evolution through natural selection. Those of us at the top of the complexity chain are simply winners in a billions of years process. Although natural selection continues today as a determinant in evolution with the emergence of human brains and consequently of culture, natural selection plays a less decisive role in the evolution of human consciousness. Arguable, but it's where I stand. It is here that language and memes and culture itself and technology take an upper hand in the development of the human mind, if such a thing actually exists. The argument over if there's a thing called the mind or not is still out there. So anyway, next level, permanence. Permanence is the degree of consciousness on the spectrum where beings are aware that entities interacting with them and sharing their environment do not cease to exist when they are not in their line of sight or range of hearing. It's also a very basic, level of human development where we know that when mom walks out of the room, she still exists. So, next level, intention. Intention is the earliest degree of consciousness on the spectrum where choice becomes evident. A cognitive entity, aware of the permanence of the entities and objects around it, is able to make a decision regarding them. Notice how this is building one level to the next. Options become apparent to them, and they are able to choose from among them a course of action. Though uncertain or unaware of the possible consequences, the entity is able to think, though not necessarily with actual words, but is able to think in essence, or the equivalent of, between A and B, I will do B. Next level, foresight. At this degree of consciousness, a being is not only able to make a choice between two or more courses, the being is able to predict possible outcomes. An entity exhibiting the degree of foresight is aware of consequences, is cognitive of cause and effect, and can act or choose not to act on a course of action as a result of reward or punishment. Now we're at level 9. We're way up there. Self-awareness. It is at the degree of self-awareness that an entity becomes aware of itself as a being distinct and separate from other beings with which it interacts. This is the level where an entity, though it may not possess language, has the concept of I. It may not say I, right? Cats don't say I, to my knowledge, but they're aware, right, that they are separate from other entities. As with all levels of the spectrum, self-awareness exists on a broad spectrum. From the basic awareness of separateness as a being from other beings and the recognition of an I, to self-examination and the varying degrees of intellectual activity, the spectrum of self-awareness is vast. The standard definition of consciousness, and this is where I get into a lot of arguments online, or at least I used to when I've wasted time doing it, with people who discuss these things. The standard definition of consciousness is what I identify as self-awareness, a level of consciousness occurring next to last in increased complexity along the spectrum. Most people who want to discuss what consciousness is, and I'm just elaborating now, are at this level. They're talking about self-awareness, which to me is just a degree of consciousness. They're saying self-awareness and consciousness are synonymous, and I disagree. So anyway, self-awareness is consciousness, yes, but it is a highly evolved expression of a phenomenon that we can trace back to the quantum level. Having a sense of I is not the be-all and end-all of consciousness. It is neither the starting point nor the culmination. It is merely one, albeit a highly complex expression of consciousness. Much has been written and discussed about I and I-ness as an emergent property of the amalgamation of multitudinous, many unknown phenomena and processes. This paper, the one I wrote, strives to trace the origin of all those processes back through the levels of complexity and finally pinpoint the origin of consciousness at a quantum or in a quantum event. And finally, global awareness. Having built upon all previous levels of consciousness on the spectrum, a being that achieves this level, global consciousness, and to my current knowledge, only humans can be said to have done so, although an argument can be made that whales and dolphins and some other species may also have achieved this level. This level becomes aware of its relationship and impact on all other entities with which it interacts, as well as those it interacts with only by proxy or through a chain of events, and those with whom it does not interact, but is aware of their existence, even to the whole earth and beyond. At this level, a being is not only conscious of another, It is aware of all others, and not just those of its own species. All humans, all animals, all plant life, the awareness of species lost to extinction, and the possibility of species yet to be discovered. These are all thoughts which can occur to a being at this degree of consciousness. And some elaboration. Not only does a consciousness appear on a continuous spectrum, and not only is each degree built and dependent upon those preceding it, we can think of consciousness like a combustion engine, with each degree being equivalent to a cylinder. The degree of reactivity is a one-cylinder engine. Bonding is a two-cylinder engine. Global awareness is a 10-cylinder engine. At every level, all cylinders of that particular degree are firing all at once. Not at any time does activity occur on any given level without all other levels being engaged. Not to promote or encourage militarism, but a great example of a 10-cylinder engine, global awareness, could be a military leader plotting the retaking of a city controlled by whoever he or his bosses don't like. His decisions include the enemy, the civilians, collateral damage, political, social, and economic outcomes of a victory or a defeat, promotions or demotions, his own personal conscience, the cost of both human and monetary terms, and on and on. This individual is firing on all 10 cylinders. From the awareness of other persons involved, known personnel and unknown civilians, all the way down to the electrons dancing in his brain with each consideration, every degree of consciousness is active in such an event. I would be remiss if I did not mention the role of language in regard to consciousness. Some would argue that language is essential, if not necessary, to consciousness. Clearly, I would say they are wrong. Language emerges on the upper end of self-awareness and is pervasive and perhaps necessary to global awareness. Language may also be, and most likely is, responsible for the leap in the expression of consciousness experienced by human beings. Yet, I would argue that rather than being a requirement of consciousness, language, however crucial to the degree of consciousness one achieves, it is, however crucial to the degree of consciousness. I tried to edit myself there and realized I messed up. So, language is crucial to the development of the upper levels of consciousness in human beings. That's what I meant to say. I would also contend that language becomes even more important as one reaches the upper end, whatever its penultimate point may be. In other words, it is arguable that the more advanced our language skills as individuals, the more advanced we may be along the scale. This is not to say an individual's vocabulary solely determines how far they go. Persons with certain developmental and social disorders may have astronomical vocabularies and yet be on the cusp or even shy of self-awareness. Hindu yogis, Buddhist monks, and mystics of various traditions have comparably small vocabularies and yet exhibit or possess a consciousness bordering on universal or cosmic. I know I risk slipping into metaphysics with such a remark, but who's to say such a degree of consciousness is unreal or unattainable? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So that was fun.